My name is Jesse Clayton and I am 35 years old. For 5 long years, I taught kindergarten in Tupelo and kept the daily logs. Wyatt walked into my classroom with his heavy boots muddying the floor. "You are always better with finger paint than figures," he said. I quietly kept my blue pen steady against the paper. My brother made sure everyone heard him say it. I wrote down the exact time of his arrival in the margin. Each day started out with an identical sequence of paperwork and graphs. The massive vintage oak cabinet rested against the rear wall, its heavy brass hinges stayed dull and unpolished. I kept receipts and notes tucked away inside its dark shelves. No one else knew what rested behind those wooden doors. The young children played quietly in the corner block area. They repeated every word they heard in their own homes. As I flipped the next leaf in the case file, I sat listening for the bell. The green ledger remained open and waiting right in front of me. Before the next part, take a second and subscribe. What was inside that oak cabinet changes everything you are about to hear, and I do not want you to miss it. I will say this plainly. There is no shouting match coming. This is a patient, quiet reckoning, and it lands harder for being quiet. Drop a note while you are visiting to let me know what global location you are tuning in from. Teaching young children shows you how people become themselves. They do not invent their habits from nothing. They copy the room around them with absolute precision. I watched them every single morning at the small wooden tables. They held their crayons exactly the way their fathers held heavy ceramic mugs. When I sat at my desk after the bell rang, I approached my daily logs with that same steady attention to detail. Every mark in my ledger mattered. A missing receipt or a misplaced note created a tiny fracture in the record. People think children forget everything they see. They do not. They absorb the small, quiet tensions in the hallway and carry them forward into the afternoon. Every single mark inside my green ledger mattered deeply to the total accuracy of the system I maintained every week. The busy classroom trained my quiet mind for what came later, because order always matters in every single record kept. Order matters. Every single entry reveals a genuine tale to anyone capable of interpreting it. Our house operated under a strange internal code. My father wrote nothing down about it. My brother Wyatt memorized every word of it before he turned 10. The principle governed every financial choice we made across decades. Whatever savings accumulated through quiet personal discipline belonged by unwritten decree to the sibling who shouted loudest about preserving our heritage. Wyatt understood this better than anyone else in our county. He practiced the art of public performance every single day. I preferred the quiet corners of the school library. I kept my desk clean and my ledger balanced down to the final cent. Wyatt spent his afternoons shouting about honor and sacrifice across the dinner room. He pounded his fist against the oak surface until the silverware rattled. My father nodded along with every theatrical speech my brother delivered. They shared a mutual language of grand gestures and empty promises. I sat quietly near the edge and watched the plates vibrate from the force of his fist. Nobody ever asked me what I thought about the arrangements. My silence was treated as proof of agreement. My mother had passed away years before the argument over the funds began. She left behind a small wooden box filled with old recipes and receipts. Wyatt claimed those papers proved his dedication to our lineage long before the tuition question ever surfaced. He told our relatives that he alone carried the burden of our shared history. His voice echoed off the plaster walls with practiced resonance. The neighbors 2 doors down could hear him through the open windows. Everyone nodded because loudness was mistaken for strength in our town. My father poured more coffee and smiled at Wyatt like an indulgent judge. I looked down at my blue pen and kept my thoughts to myself. The rules of the house were older than the floorboards beneath our boots. You learned early on that arguing against the noise was entirely useless. The family expected compliance wrapped in theatrical displays of devotion. Wyatt provided the theater every single evening without fail. I provided the actual labor and the steady income from my kindergarten classroom. Tupelo mornings started early for me, but Wyatt slept until noon while planning his next grievance. He treated every bank statement like a personal insult directed at his dignity. My father listened to these morning grievances with total devotion. They shared old stories about local politics while I graded spelling worksheets at the kitchen counter. The household hierarchy depended entirely on who could talk the loudest about sacrifice. Saving money quietly counted for nothing in our family ledger. Every dollar I put away in the heavy oak cabinet was viewed as public property waiting for a claimant. Wyatt watched my savings grow with predatory patience. He knew the unwritten decree favored the sibling who performed the most convincing public ritual. My quiet habits made me look vulnerable to their calculated demands. I recorded every daily event in my green ledger with absolute precision. The kindergartners displayed identical behaviors during their afternoon block rotation. They argued over who owned the communal wooden blocks with identical theatrical fury. I watched them copy the exact behaviors they witnessed at their own dinner tables. Wyatt had mastered this exact mimicry decades before I started teaching. He played the role of the devoted son with terrifying theatrical accuracy. My father rewarded this performance by ignoring every financial discrepancy in Wyatt Ledger. The family law functioned like gravity in our kitchen. You did not question why the apple fell toward the floor. You simply braced yourself for the impact and kept breathing. Wyatt prepared his final pitch for the funds with meticulous care. He drafted lists of demands on yellow legal pads and left them where everyone could see them. My father read those papers and nodded in solemn agreement. The coming pressure felt completely normal to everyone except me. I kept my blue pen moving across the daily log. The ink flowed smoothly while the house around me prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Every page of my ledger recorded the steady march toward a reckoning that had been decades in the making. Ray Gentry arrived shortly after 3 o'clock with a grease-stained clipboard tucked beneath his arm. Ray worked down at the county annex managing road maintenance reports for the district offices. He dropped the wooden clipboard onto the kitchen table with a heavy thud that rattled my ink bottle. The heavy old oak cabinet stood against the back wall with its dull brass hinges catching the fading afternoon light. I kept my pen moving steadily across the ruled green ledger page. Ray wiped his boots carefully on the woven mat by the back door. He looked around the kitchen with tired eyes and shifted his weight. Ray set his leather satchel down on the floorboards near the corner. The leather was scuffed and worn along the bottom seams from years of daily use. You spend hours writing down every single penny that passes through this house, Ray said quietly. I did not look up from the columns of figures spread across my desk. Ray stared at the dark wood grain of the tabletop instead of meeting my gaze. He always looked nervous whenever my older brother was anywhere nearby. Wyatt pushed the back door open before Ray could speak another word to me. My older brother stomped his mud-caked boots across the clean floorboards while the afternoon shadows lengthened across the room. Wyatt carried a rolled stack of blue municipal blueprints under his arm while he walked toward the counter. He tossed the damp rolls onto the pine boards right beside my daily notes. "You are wasting good ink on empty pages," Wyatt said. Ray shifted his feet and looked down at his own worn shoes with deep concentration. Ray kept his mouth shut tight against the rising tension in the room. Wyatt pulled out a wooden chair with a loud scrape against the floor. He leaned his forearms flat against the scarred surface of the table with deliberate weight. My brother reached across my notes and flipped a page back to check the column totals. "You were always better with finger paint than figures, Jesse," Wyatt said. A small child's drawing of a yellow school bus rested tucked beneath the back cover of the ledger. Ray looked at the crayon lines on the paper and then looked away quickly. He did not say anything to defend my work against Wyatt's mockery. Ray cleared his throat and adjusted his collar with a slow motion. He picked up his grease-stained clipboard from the edge of the table. "I just stopped by to drop off those drainage maps," Ray said to the empty space between us. Wyatt ignored him completely and poured himself a cup of black coffee from the pot on the stove. "Let the school teacher play with his little green books," Wyatt said without looking back. Ray pressed his lips into a thin line and stepped backward toward the exit. He did not want any trouble with my brother today. Ray turned the brass doorknob with a trembling hand and pulled the panel inward. The heavy wooden door swung open to let in a draft of cool evening air. "The county needs those tax assessments finished by Friday," Ray said from the threshold. Wyatt waved a hand dismissively without turning around from his spot by the stove. Ray slipped outside and pulled the door shut behind him with a gentle click. I dipped my pen into the inkwell once more to finish the remaining entries. The quiet returned to the kitchen while the last bit of daylight faded completely from the windows. The kitchen floor creaked under heavy boots. Wyatt stood by the back door with a rolled set of municipal blueprints under his arm. He dropped his iron keys onto the wooden table with a sharp clatter. My green ledger lay open beside my white coffee cup. Wyatt looked down at the neatly ruled columns with a cold smile. "You spend all your time drawing lines in little books," Wyatt said to the empty air. He did not look at me when he spoke. I kept my pen resting beside the red margin. The morning air felt cold against the glass pane. Wyatt pulled out a wooden chair and sat down hard. He reached across the table and tapped the paper with a thick finger. Tupelo has no room for men who only keep accounts, Wyatt said. My father walked into the room behind him. My father pulled a cotton handkerchief from his pocket and coughed. The old man leaned against the door frame and nodded slowly at Wyatt. The family name requires more than quiet little notes in a book, my father said. Wyatt crossed his broad arms and looked up at the ceiling. A house is judged by the men who stand tall in the county, Wyatt said. He shifted his weight and leaned further forward over the wood. You lack the stomach for real business, Jesse, Wyatt said. I picked up my pen and capped it with a soft click. The ink was still wet on the ruled page. My father walked over to the iron stove and poured himself a dark cup of coffee. He stirred the hot liquid with a silver spoon. The spoon made a sharp, ringing sound against the ceramic. Wyatt watched him with a satisfied look on his face. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. I looked down at the worn grain of the wood table. A child repeats the walls they live inside, I whispered softly to the empty room. The words drifted through my mind like dust motes in the sunlight. Wyatt stood up and paced toward the porcelain sink. He tossed a metal ring of keys onto the metal counter. You will hand over the keys to the heavy cabinet by Friday, Wyatt said. He turned around and glared at me with hard eyes. A man who hides behind a desk has no claim to anything here, Wyatt said. My father took a sip of his black coffee without turning around. The steam rose in thin spirals toward the wooden ceiling. Neither of them waited for my answer. They walked out the back door together into the bright morning yard. The latch clicked shut with a heavy sound. I sat alone at the wooden table. The green ledger stayed open to the current page. Every entry looked neat and orderly. The numbers balanced down to the final cent, but the balance in the room had shifted completely. I closed the book with a slow and deliberate movement. My fingers rested against the green cloth cover. The silence of the kitchen felt heavier than before. I reached for my blue pen and opened the drawer. The small brass key lay hidden under a pile of old paper receipts. I did not touch the key just yet. I stared at the dark grain of the wood. The humiliation settled deep into my bones without a single word of protest. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Tupelo mornings usually brought a sense of steady purpose to my work. Today the room felt remarkably small and airless. I traced the edge of the green cover with my thumb. Wyatt would never understand the patience required to maintain a balanced life. My father would always reward the loudest voice in the room. I stood up from the wooden chair and walked to the window. The truck engine sputtered to life outside in the gravel driveway. Exhaust smoke drifted past the glass panes. I remained standing by the window until the truck drove away down the road. The school bell rang at 3 in the afternoon. Children packed their blue folders into small plastic crates. Crayon stubs rolled across low tables. I wiped the green chalkboard with a damp felt eraser. White dust settled on my sleeves. I walked out the heavy front doors into the humid Tupelo air. My boots crunched softly on gravel. The walk home took 20 minutes. The house sat quietly behind a row of overgrown boxwoods. Front steps creaked under my boots. I turned the brass key in the lock. The hallway smelled of old paper and boiled potatoes. Wyatt sat at the dining table with his blue municipal blueprints. He did not look up when I walked past. My father watched a small television in the corner. The screen flickered with muted blue light. I went straight to the back room. The oak cabinet stood against the dark paneling. Its brass hinges caught the late sunlight. I opened the lower door. It made a low, dry sound. This piece of furniture became my new boundary. I placed my leather pencil pouch inside the lower shelf. Extra receipts went into a small cardboard box. A stack of blue index cards joined them. Every item found a permanent home behind those wooden doors. I slid the latch shut. It clicked firmly into place. Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall. Seconds passed without a single spoken word. I sat down at the small table near the window. My green ledger lay closed beside my blue pen. I opened to a clean page. Ink flowed smoothly across the paper. Numbers aligned in neat vertical columns. I recorded the school attendance figures from the morning session. 35 children attended class today. 2 students stayed home with heavy coughs. I noted each absence in the side margin. My handwriting remained steady and small. The space between my brother and me widened into something permanent. Neither of us mentioned the kitchen argument from yesterday. Words were entirely unnecessary now. Wyatt stayed at his end of the house. I remained at mine. We shared the same roof but occupied different centuries. I gathered my receipts from the morning grocery run. Prices of milk and flour went into the weekly column. $4.50 for sugar, $3 for fresh butter. Every cent required absolute precision. The oak cabinet waited quietly against the far wall. It held my spare pens and receipts. Nothing of mine remained exposed on the open counters. I kept my personal belongings locked away from view. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the floorboards. Dust motes danced in the waning yellow light. I dipped my pen into the blue inkwell. The nib scratched softly against the cotton paper. Teaching kindergarten taught me how to watch small details. Children showed their feelings through quiet imitation. They copied the posture of the adults who raised them. I closed the green ledger with a deliberate motion. My hands did not shake at all. Tomorrow would bring another classroom of restless 6-year-olds. For now, the room remained still. I placed the ledger inside the wooden drawer. I locked it with a tiny silver key. The key went straight into my coat pocket. I stood up and stretched my stiff shoulders. Evening settled over the small Tupelo neighborhood. Crickets began to chirp in the tall grass outside. I walked to the kitchen to start the kettle. Wyatt remained at the dining table. His shadow stretched long across the faded linoleum. We passed each other like strangers in a narrow hallway. Neither of us offered a greeting. The water started to whistle on the stove. I poured the hot liquid into a ceramic mug. Steam rose toward the ceiling in gentle curls. I drank in silence while looking out the window. The dark streetlights flickered on one by one. Another day ended without incident or resolution. I returned to the back room to check the cabinet latch. Everything stayed secure in its proper place. My new routine felt comfortable in its predictability. I have to pause and ask, have you ever been the reliable one, the person everybody counted on and nobody thanked, right up until the day they needed someone to blame? If you have, tell me in the comments what that did to you. I am asking honestly. So much of this story is about being underestimated, and I would like to know I am in good company. The calendar pages turned without noise. 3 full years slipped past the classroom windows. I taught the children how to hold crayons properly. They traced shapes inside blue margins. I watched them copy every adult habit. My own habits grew sharper in the quiet room. Every evening brought the green ledger back to my desk. I submerged my writing instrument into the black fluid. I recorded each attendance mark with absolute precision. The Tupelo heat rose and fell through the seasons. Wyatt drove his red truck past the schoolyard twice a week. He never stopped. My attention remained fixed upon the grading work. The record grew thicker inside the heavy cabinet. Winter mornings brought frost to the window panes. The children sat at small tables with blunt scissors. They cut construction paper into neat squares. I walked between the rows with my blue pen in hand. I logged every absence and every late arrival. My records were silent witnesses to the passage of time. Nobody asked about the disputed accounts anymore. Wyatt thought the matter was settled by his loud voice. He spent money from the family funds without consulting anyone. I wrote down the dates and the receipts anyway. Each transaction went into the green book. Nothing was left to memory. Memory fades when you rely on it too long. Ray Gentry dropped by the feed store parking lot sometimes. He nodded from a distance when our paths crossed near the town square. He looked older around the eyes now. He carried the weight of Wyatt decisions without receiving any reward. I stayed away from the two of them. My life settled into a steady rhythm of teaching and logging. The old oak cabinet held 400 receipts by then. I counted them twice every month to ensure accuracy. Every paper had a date stamped in blue ink. Every invoice told a story of quiet overreach. Spring returned with heavy rains against the window panes. The children built towers with wooden blocks in the corner. One boy stacked them too high before walking away. The tower crashed down across the floor. The other children laughed and started building again. Beside the window, I held my notes. I wrote the time of the minor collapse in the margin. The habit of the profession became a private discipline. You keep records because forgetting costs more than remembering. Late day sunshine glided over the timber flooring. I closed the green book with a firm motion. The brass latch clicked securely in the empty room. Tomorrow would bring a fresh page and more small entries. I placed the ledger inside the dark wood container. The brass hinges remained cold to the touch. Silence remained my strongest shield against intrusion. No letters arrived from Wyatt during those months. He assumed my quietness meant total defeat. he continued managing the estate accounts as his personal bank. I let him build his case against himself, every month added fresh proof to the drawer. Summer heat pressed hard against the school windows. Cicadas buzzed in the oak trees outside. My blue pen continued moving across the green paper. The children painted paper plates at the low tables. Their tiny hands smeared bright yellows and greens. I wiped a stray drop of blue tempera from a desk corner. Wyatt parked his red truck near the feed store. He walked past the playground with a heavy and purposeful stride. He thought the town belonged entirely to him. I checked the date in the top margin. $24,000 were still unaccounted for from the grandfather fund. I wrote down the current balance without a sound. Autumn brought dry leaves swirling across the asphalt. Ray Gentry walked past my gate during his lunch break. He tipped his cap toward the classroom window. I gave him a brief nod in return. He looked tired of carrying Wyatt burdens. Nobody asked me about the old accounts anymore. Wyatt assumed my silence meant complete surrender. He spent money on new equipment for his business. Every invoice arrived in the mail weeks later. I filed each yellow paper inside the wooden box. The heavy brass hinges stayed stiff and cold against the dry wood. The school year turned over once again. New 5-year-olds sat at the tiny chairs. They learned to share wooden blocks and crayons. I watched them copy every adult gesture they saw. A small girl folded her arms just like Wyatt did. I made a quiet note in the daily log. Habits take root before children even learn to spell. My own habits were just as fixed. Every evening ended at the desk with ink and paper. The stack of records grew heavier inside the drawer. Wyatt signed more papers without my consent. I logged each document by its exact number. Winter rain tapped against the glass panes. The classroom smelled of wet wool and paste. I graded papers while the children rested on small mats. My blue ink flowed smoothly on the lined sheets. Another year passed without a single confrontation from Wyatt. He believed time worked entirely in his favor. He did not know that every receipt built a trap. I flipped to the next sheet in the green ledger. The columns balanced with absolute precision. Nothing was guessed and nothing was forgotten. Spring brought yellow blossoms to the yard. Ray stopped by the fence while I watered the plants. He talked about the weather for a few minutes. Then he mentioned Wyatt expanding his operations into town. I listened without asking any questions. Ray looked away toward the distant water tower. He knew something was wrong with the ledger books. He walked away without saying much more. I returned to my desk inside the warm room. I opened the oak container and checked the receipts. 400 items rested in neat rows. The autumn air felt crisp and sharp. I walked home along the familiar sidewalks of Tupelo. Streetlights flickered on one by one in the dusk. My coat pocket held the small leather notebook. Its pages were filled with undeniable facts. The final bell rang for the afternoon. The children packed their small backpacks and lined up. Their parents waited by the front entrance in cars. I waved goodbye as the last student left. The room grew entirely still except for the clock. I sat down at my desk with the blue pen. The cumulative record of his overreach was almost complete. Wyatt was digging his own grave with every stroke. I turned off the overhead lights and locked the door. The afternoon sun hit the floor. Dust motes drifted slowly through the air. I sharpened a yellow pencil with a small metal blade while listening to the distant murmur of children outside. The shavings curled neatly. The oak cabinet stood against the wall. Its brass hinges remained dull and quiet. I opened the heavy lower drawer with steady fingers to carefully examine all of the accumulated daily records stored inside. Every page stayed clean. Wyatt walked into the room without knocking. His heavy boots made a hollow sound. He looked much older than his 62 years, with deep gray shadows resting under his tired and weary eyes. The truck outside had broken down twice. He sat down awkwardly at the table. His large frame did not fit well. He rubbed his face with both heavy hands and let out a long breath that sounded entirely exhausted and defeated. The absolute ruler act seemed gone. "You look completely worn out today," I said quietly. He did not look up from the wood. The $24,000 from the grandfather fund was already spent on failing ventures, he said. Nothing remained of it. The silence in the room stretched out. He stared at the jars of paint. "You were always better with colors and messy hands than columns of figures, Jesse," he said softly. His voice lacked sharp arrogance. For a brief moment, he looked human. I did not say anything back. My hands remained flat against the scarred wooden surface as the ancient family tale unraveled. The seams were splitting apart. Ray Gentry had called me twice recently. He sounded worried about the ledger balances. Wyatt completely refused to listen to any warnings regarding his reckless financial overreach throughout the entire county. The system was cracking open. The green ledger lay hidden below sheets. I touched the worn leather cover softly. Every single receipt told a very specific story about the missing money that could never be erased. Nothing remained truly hidden. He stood up slowly from the chair. His joints made a sharp sound. He adjusted his collar with a slightly trembling hand and looked toward the exit with heavy eyes, the weight pressed down hard. "I have to figure out repairs," he muttered. He walked out into the cool hallway. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind his broad shoulders while I picked up my blue ink pen. The room stayed quiet. The classroom returned to its rhythm. I turned to a clean page. Tupelo kept moving at its usual slow pace outside the tall windows while afternoon shadows lengthened across the street. The truth needed no shouts. Every receipt remained locked securely inside. The system required absolute patience. I wrote the afternoon attendance numbers down in neat dark ink because the foundation was shifting underneath them. The numbers did not lie. The children would return very soon. I straightened the blue plastic trays. My daily life followed a completely predictable and honest path while the quiet reckoning moved closer each day. The harbor remained safe. The walls offered an orderly harbor. Outside, the town continued its routines. I closed the green ledger with a soft and deliberate motion because the tension had reached its absolute limit. The final page awaited. The morning notes were already filed away. I checked the ink level in my pen. Everything was documented with precise care so that no one could ever question the accuracy of the record. The margins stayed clean. The blue ink dried quickly on the page. A quiet satisfaction settled over my shoulders. The cracks in their carefully constructed world were widening every single hour until nothing could hold them together. The ledger was ready. Have you ever watched someone spend money they did not earn? Did you keep quiet while the ledgers piled high with proof? Drop a quick comment below and tell me how you handled the heavy weight. Staying silent was never the same thing as forgetting. I remembered every single entry recorded in my green book. The steady blue ink never lies on the page. That heavy oak cabinet remained locked in the dark back room. $24,000 quietly waited for the final reckoning here. The heavy white envelope rested on the kitchen table directly beside my green ledger. Wyatt believed that formal typed documents carried far more legal authority than anything ever spoken across the room during our long disputes. I unfolded the crisp pages with steady fingers and read through every line he had printed. This paper listed $24,000 in disputed expenses that he demanded I repay immediately. Wyatt assumed my silence over the years meant total agreement with his creative bookkeeping methods. He signed his name at the very end of the document without realizing what he had admitted on paper. "I need this money returned to the family account by Friday," Wyatt said, standing near the doorway with his heavy coat half-zipped. I looked up from the page and met his gaze without any trace of anger in my expression. "You wrote down every single transaction here yourself," I said, pointing a finger toward the typed columns. He frowned and took a slow step closer to the table, squinting against the morning light. "That is how accounting works when you run things properly," he said, adjusting his collar with a familiar twitch. "Except you listed funds that never belonged to the business operations at all," I said, turning a page in my green ledger. The typed demand list detailed specific bank transfers from dates when the grandfather fund was untouched by anyone else. Wyatt had itemized withdrawals that matched my own notes down to the exact penny. He had essentially drafted a confession while trying to bully me into submission. Ray Gentry waited outside in the truck, unwilling to step inside the kitchen while Wyatt pushed his luck. Ray knew how those numbers refused to balance whenever someone looked too closely at the margins. He had brought his own cardboard folder weeks ago, hinting at the same discrepancies. I closed the green ledger and slid the typed demand list inside the wooden cover. "You signed a complete record of your own unauthorized withdrawals," I said, keeping my voice entirely even. Wyatt stared at the paper for a long second, his eyes finally registering the specific dates he had typed out. His face went completely pale upon comprehending what the paperwork genuinely verified regarding his guilt. He reached out a hand toward the table, but I pulled the ledger back out of his reach. "You cannot just change the rules when the math catches up with you," I said, watching his fingers halt in midair. Without uttering anything further to justify himself, he pivoted to face the exit. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone with the morning quiet. Tupelo mornings always brought a strange sort of stillness after the shouting stopped. I opened the old oak cabinet against the back wall and slid the papers into their proper file. Every receipt and every margin note remained exactly where it belonged for the final reckoning. The kitchen table stood clear of papers for the first time in 3 long years. Morning light hit the wood grain near the window with a sharp and unsparing clarity. I sat on the wooden chair and waited for the morning bell to ring across town. Ray Gentry walked up the porch steps with his scuffed leather satchel swinging heavily against his knee. He knocked twice on the worn screen door before stepping inside the warm and quiet room. "I brought these old county receipts for you because the district assessments changed overnight," Ray Gentry said, setting a brown paper bundle near my elbow. He looked around the room with tired eyes that avoided the corners. "I knew what Wyatt had been doing to the municipal books for a very long time. I wanted you to have these records before the formal reckoning started today." He nodded once and stepped back toward the door without asking for any reward. The heavy oak cabinet stood against the back wall like a silent witness to every transaction. I walked across the floorboards and pulled the dull brass latch with a steady hand. The door swung open smoothly to reveal the neat rows inside. Inside the dark space rested the small wooden box and the green ledger. "A child repeats the walls they live inside," I whispered softly to the empty room. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked safely inside the back cover of the book. It was a small crayon drawing of a yellow school bus with uneven windows. One wheel was missing from the sketch because a kindergarten student had pressed too hard with the yellow wax. I pulled the drawing out and laid it flat on the table next to the county receipts. Wyatt opened the front door a moment later with his heavy mud-caked boots making a loud scraping sound. "You are always making too much of these little papers, Jesse," Wyatt said, walking straight toward the head of the table. I looked up from the drawing without moving my hands an inch across the grain. The green ledger remained shut tight beside the bus sketch with absolute stillness. $24,000 of missing funds rested silently in the columns of that leather-bound book. "You brought the wrong papers today, Wyatt," I said, keeping my voice entirely steady against the sudden draft. He stopped moving abruptly and stared down at the wood grain between us with narrowed eyes. The silence in the room stretched wider than it had ever done during my years of teaching. Wyatt pulled out a wooden chair and sat down heavily with his shoulders slumped. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the corner of the typed demand list. Neither of us spoke another word as the grandfather clock ticked away the final seconds. Ray stood near the door and watched the two men without making a sound. The quiet inside the room felt heavy and complete. Wyatt stared down at the paper on the table. $24,000 was written in black ink right above his signature. He reached out to pull the sheet away. My fingers rested flat against the edge of the wood. "You are always better with finger paint than figures, Jesse," he muttered with a dry rasp in his throat. I did not blink or move an inch. The ledger remained closed beside the yellow bus drawing. Ray stood quietly by the doorway with his hands tucked deep into his pockets. He cleared his throat and took a slow step backward. "I just wanted to bring those maps before the county office closed today," Ray said to nobody in particular. He looked down at the floorboards for a long moment. Wyatt kept his head bowed low against the morning light. The ink on the demand list was dark and permanent. Every single line matched the notes I kept in the green book. "A child repeats the walls they live inside," I said softly. Wyatt did not look up from the table. The silence stretched across the kitchen floor without a single word of argument. Ray nodded once to me and turned toward the open door. The heavy wooden screen swung shut behind him with a dull click. I left the ledger sitting right where it was. Wyatt let out a long breath and stood up from his chair. He walked out of the house without looking at me once. The morning sun climbed higher over the Tupelo rooftops. I pulled the green book toward me and picked up my blue pen. The final entry was already complete. The kitchen was entirely my own again. The ledger rested flat on the kitchen table. Its green cover was worn at the corners. I picked up my blue pen and looked at the blank page. Wyatt sat across from me in his usual silence. He waited for the blow to fall. He knew I held the papers that could ruin him completely. Ray Gentry stood near the doorway with his hat in his hands. The morning air felt cold against the glass. I could have handed the documents to Ray right then. I could have watched everything Wyatt built crumble into dust before the sun reached noon. I did not do it. My hand stayed steady on the smooth wood of the desk. Revenge was a heavy tool that cut both ways. The paper stayed tucked inside the heavy oak cabinet against the back wall. Nobody else needed to dig through those receipts and invoices. Wyatt looked down at his boots. He expected a grand speech about justice or family honor. I gave him nothing of the sort. Teaching small children every single day taught me a different lesson entirely. When a child breaks something in the classroom, screaming never fixes the wood. You simply clean up the pieces and teach them how to hold the tools correctly next time. I closed the ledger with a quiet snap. The brass latch did not make a sound. Ray shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked confused by my stillness. "You are always better with simple tasks," Wyatt muttered under his breath. I ignored the dig entirely. Let him keep his pride. Taking his livelihood away would not bring back the years we lost. It would only drag me down into the same muddy trench he dug for himself. I slid the green book back into its dark drawer. The brass key remained untouched in my pocket. Ray cleared his throat and checked his watch. The county tax office would open in less than an hour. Neither of us spoke about the missing ledger balances anymore. The threat dissolved into the morning light without a single shout. Quiet restraint required more strength than any public fight. The house remained standing against the wind. The children would arrive at school in 20 minutes. I gathered my coat and my small leather notebook from the desk. Wyatt remained seated at the table like a stranger waiting for a train that was never going to stop. He did not say thank you. He did not have to. The debt remained unsettled on paper but settled in my mind. I walked out the back door and left the ledger locked in the dark room. The morning chill felt clean against my face. Walking down the dirt road toward the schoolhouse, the weight in my chest felt lighter. Tupelo woke up slowly beneath a pale gray sky. Every fence post cast a long shadow across the grass. I kept my stride steady and even. The classroom door would be unlocked by now. 35 small chairs waited around the low wooden tables inside. My blue ink was dry. The daily notes were ready for the morning bell. I left the past sitting on the kitchen table where it belonged. The classroom smelled of damp wool and pine soap. The morning sunlight struck the small wooden tables where the children sat quietly with their yellow crayons. I opened my blue pen and drew a clean line across the fresh page of the ledger. Verdant ink glided effortlessly across the thick paper. Everything was exactly where it belonged in the room. There was no noise from the hallway. Ray shoved the weighty front door open just wide enough to pass a compact wooden box onto my desk. He nodded once before turning back toward the street. He had fixed the broken latch on the back gate without asking for any thanks. That small gesture settled a debt I never asked him to pay. I lifted the lid of the small wooden box. Inside rested the old child drawing of a house with uneven green roof lines. It was the same paper Wyatt had tossed aside during the argument at the kitchen table weeks ago. Ray must have retrieved it from the floor before he left that evening. I smoothed the folded edges with my thumb. The crayon wax had faded around the corners. I remembered the exact afternoon that child had pressed yellow wax into the heavy paper. The paper felt remarkably light against my palm. I pinned it to the corkboard beside the daily attendance chart. The children finished their morning drawings and lined up by the coat hooks. Sarah looked up at me with bright eyes and dropped her green crayon. I stooped to retrieve it for her. "You dropped your green crayon on the floor," I said to her softly. She smiled and took it back into her small fist. The room remained completely calm as the school bell rang for recess. The hallway outside stayed empty and quiet. The radiator hissed once and then fell silent. No threats waited for me at home. Discipline remained a silent daily routine maintained within this space. I closed the classroom door behind the last departing student with a gentle click. The heavy oak cabinet stood firmly against the back wall with its dull brass hinges catching the noon light. Every drawer in the room held its proper contents without complaint. Everything else required no further disruption or agitation. The records were complete and accurate down to the final entry. I strolled across the spotless floor and retrieved my blue pen from the timber desk. The afternoon stretched ahead without any sudden interruptions. I placed the small wooden box on the shelf beside the attendance register. The building grew silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside on the paved road. The Tupelo air felt calm and steady against the glass panes. I sat down at my desk and breathed out slowly. The paper drawing remained visible on the corkboard near the window. You might expect a different kind of ending. Perhaps you believe those files were stored inside the massive cupboard solely to exert control over my sibling. I failed to. The pages yellowed under the brass latch. Voices from long ago echo in small rooms, teaching us how to survive. My students learned how to speak by listening to the quiet atmosphere of their homes. I learned how to wait. That waiting is over now. I carried the thick green ledger out to the metal bin behind the schoolhouse. I struck a match against the rough side of the box. The paper caught quickly, flaring bright against the cold morning air. Black flakes drifted up toward the open sky and vanished before they touched the ground. There was no balance sheet left to prove anything to anyone. Only gray ash settling slowly in the bottom of the iron drum. That massive weight had completely vanished. Returning to the warm classroom, I grasped a pristine piece of white chalk.